unraveling of reality. Like, we are getting to the point now where it is very deeply a question in the background of all of our minds as to like what is real in the world today. And I think there's this hunger and this longing and almost this desperation for, it's like we need something real. Hey, welcome to The Golden Thread. It's great to be with you here today. And I want to start by asking a question, and that is, have you ever had a situation where there was maybe something that you were working on, maybe a problem that you were trying to solve, or a project that you were beginning where it seemed like at first it was going to be really simple and it would be quick and it would be a quick fix, an easy solution, but then the further that you got into it, the more and more complicated that it became, and you began to just start to realize that, oh wow, you'd bitten off a lot more than you were first expecting to have to chew. My wife and I, we own a farmhouse from 1830. So it's this old 200-year-old farmhouse. And so there's all kinds of situations like that where you begin to open something up and take a look at it. And maybe there's something that's not working quite right. So you get in there and you start looking at it and it just begins to multiply. And there's all of these other things. And so you almost don't even want to get involved. You just don't even want to start down that kind of rabbit trail because it can go all kinds of places that you weren't expecting. And I remember a couple of years ago, there was a plumbing situation that we had going on. And let me preface by saying this, I am not somebody who's like super handy, right? So I'm not the kind of guy who could just fix anything. But when you've got, a 200-year-old house, it is very helpful to be able to do some things yourself, because if you don't, the costs just begin to mount. And so whenever I can get in there, if there is some sort of project where I think, okay, maybe I can manage this, then I try to get in there and take a look at it. And so there were some various kind of minor plumbing things that were going on, nothing super major. So I said, well, you know what, I think I can probably address some of these, and I did. And so, but the more that I started to get into it, I remember there was this one bathroom that we had that there were kind of various problems that were happening, and one of the problems was that we were having some leaking from the toilet, and the toilet was probably quite old, and so we said, you know what, why don't we just replace it? We'll just replace it. And I said to myself, you know what, I could do that. Like, what could go wrong, right? what could possibly happen? And so I had a friend who was a little bit more handy than myself. Always good to have that friend, right, that you can call. And I said, hey, would you mind? This is my first time doing this. Would you mind coming over and maybe we could kind of work on this together? He said, absolutely, no problem. And so he comes over and we start working on this thing, and everything is going great, right? Everything is going just swimmingly. We've got everything there. We pull the old one out. We get the new seal in there. We get it sealed. We put the new one. We get everything going, and then as we are going along, suddenly we come to a point where we realize that this is not going to work, that we'd made some miscalculations in our measurements, and we ended up having to go back and basically undo everything that we had done and do it all over again. And this was just like the beginning of this sort of long, multi-week, might have even been months process of like trying different things. Try this, try that. This didn't work. Okay, well then let's go back and try this. And it ended up where the thing that we ended up doing was we ended up taking out the toilet from one of the other bathrooms and swapping it with the one that was leaking, and then getting rid of the leaking one and bringing in a new one. Anyway, we eventually got it to where we said, okay, I think we finally cracked this thing. I think we finally solved it. And then the next day, I go into that bathroom where we've installed the toilet. Everything should be running properly, and I look down and there's water on the floor, and the toilet that we have moved into the bathroom. Now, this is not the toilet that was leaking. This is the toilet from the other bathroom that we had swapped with it. Now that toilet is leaking in exactly the same fashion as the one that we just removed. It was like one of those moments where you just like want to pull your hair out, or beard in this case, right? You want to rend your garments. You're like, ah! And so I had that garment rending moment, and it lasted for some time. And it was just one of those situations where it's just like things multiply after thing after thing after thing. And I just remember thinking, it's like, if I had known that it was going to be like this, I never even would have opened up this Pandora's box to begin with. Well, we'll come back to that story. That story does have a happier ending, and so we'll share that with you in just a moment here. But I want to use this as a way of talking about some of the things that we are experiencing even in our culture today. You know, I think that we're in a time in our culture where we are experiencing a multiplicity of issues that just seem to kind of multiply almost endlessly. And you could take any one of these issues, and we won't get into the weeds here on all of these, but you could take any of the kinds of societal issues that we see today, whether they're political or cultural or religious or even in terms of the arts, or just any of these things, any of the issues that we see around us. And you as soon as you start looking into it and you start kind of going down that rabbit hole, things begin to multiply and multiply and multiply. And a lot of times that, you know, even some of the solutions that are attempted just seem to actually ultimately create more problems. And those problems continue to multiply endlessly. And it's very similar, I think, in nature to what we talked about in a few episodes prior, where we talked about the Iliad, right? And we talked about the Trojan War and how the Greeks were in this situation where they got into this conflict where they thought it would be a one and done. It was going to be quick and easy. And it turns into this 10 years, this decade-long embroilment, this kind of Vietnam sort of situation, this quagmire that they can't seem to get out of and they can't seem to come to a conclusion. And in the case of the Trojan War, the solution that the Greeks are able to come to is that they're able to unify themselves against a common adversary, right? So it's this sort of situation where the Greek culture has broken down to the point where there's no sort of positive way of unifying themselves, but instead they're able to turn to a negative way of unifying themselves. And they say, well, you know what? Here we are fighting each other. Maybe we should actually fight the Trojans, right? Maybe this is the common adversary that we can unify ourselves against. And it doesn't solve the cultural problem for the Greeks, because they still have this kind of fractured situation going on in their society that has been revealed by the conflict, as we talked about. But at least they're able to unify enough to be able to win the war. But this is, I think, a dynamic that we see a lot when cultures are beginning to unravel, when situations are beginning to unravel, or even in our own lives, even personally, when things begin to fall apart. There's this kind of instinct to sort of look for an enemy, right? It's like, okay, well, where's the enemy, right? And it's this sort of instinct that we have that can actually be very dangerous, because it can cause all kinds of infighting and division, which is what happens among the Greeks. But what saves them is that they're able to sort of unite against a common adversary. But in the modern dilemma, it feels like that's something that we really haven't been able to do here in Western civilization. Like, we haven't been able to, there has been that pattern of trying to find an enemy, right? It seems like that's happening all the time in the news and all around us, where things are becoming more and more polarized and combative and so forth. And there's a lot of finger pointing and name calling and all of those kinds of things. And it just feels like it's so hard to even just have a civil conversation anymore with this kind of atmosphere. So there's this sort of instinct of like, oh, we've got to find the enemy. But the problem seems to be that we can't decide on what that enemy actually is, or what that adversary actually is, or which one to prioritize. And I think it's because of the nature of the situation where we find ourselves, which is that there are so many issues. There are so many issues that are constantly cropping up, and every day it's one of those where it's like you almost don't even want to look at the news. You don't want to look at this or that, because it's always something new. And the moment that something seems like it's going to be resolved and solved in some way, some other issue springs up, and maybe 5 more underneath that. And so it can become sort of overwhelming, and we can imagine ourselves even in our lives getting into a situation where it's like things just kind of multiply endlessly to the point where you just kind of want to just shut it off because it's too much. It's just too much and too overwhelming. And so there's this sense of division. And what this reminds me of is it reminds me of some of the ancient stories with regard to monsters. And there are stories about a certain kind of monster that we see. There's different kinds of monster stories, monster myths. And one of these kinds of stories has to do with a certain kind of enemy, a certain kind of monster, which is basically the image of the many-headed monster. And we see this all throughout culture. We see this all across the face of the globe. We see it all we see the stories of many-headed serpents or many-headed dragons. We see these in Babylonian myths and Assyrian myths. We see them in Slavic and Eastern European myths. We see other kinds of monsters as well. We even see in the biblical accounts. We see in the apocalyptic narratives. We see the idea of the many-headed beast or the many-headed dragon. And in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament in the Bible, we see these kinds of ideas of multi-headed monsters. And in the Greek myths, in the Greek stories, we see several of these. We see Cerberus, the three-headed dog. We also see the story of the Hydra. And I want to take just a moment to talk a little bit about the story of the Hydra. And the Hydra in Greek myth was basically a many-headed dragon or a many-headed serpent that was set as a guard to one of the doors of the underworld. And so the Hydra is guarding this door to the underworld, which is in a lake or a swamp, and what happens is that the great Greek hero Hercules or Heracles, he is sent to go and fight the Hydra. He has to slay the Hydra as one of these 12 tasks that he's been set upon. And so he goes to this place and he faces the Hydra and he begins to do battle with the Hydra. But what happens is, as he is doing battle with the many heads of this monster, the many kind of snakes, that he begins to discover that every head that he severs, every time that he chops a head off, that two more spring back in its place. And Hercules is this, of course, this mythic, famous figure of just incredible strength, but all of his strength is useless to him. He's unable to defeat this monster because every time that he goes after one of these enemies, two more spring back. And so every time that he attacks one of them, he's actually just making problems worse, and he's just multiplying this. And I think that this is a characteristic of the sort of situation that we see in the world today, that I think that there is this sense of the many-headedness of the world, right? And we'll talk more about this in subsequent episodes. There's this kind of multiplicity that just seems to want to multiply itself endlessly. And there's a temptation to want to fight every battle. There's a temptation to want to get pulled in, to respond to every comment, or to, go after every single issue, or to, and it becomes this sort of thing where we begin to fracture almost psychologically because we're being pulled in so many different directions and there's so many different voices that it begins to kind of tear us apart internally. And so what we have to do is we have to think about, how do we respond to this? I think that the way in which we need to respond in the world today, one of the things that can be very helpful for us as we're facing these kinds of dilemmas in the world, is to do what Hercules does, and that is to take a step back, right? So Hercules, the first thing that he has to do in order to keep from being overwhelmed, as he's being overwhelmed by these adversaries, is he has to take a step back. He's got to stop trying to fight every single battle. And as he takes a step back, he's able to survey the situation. He's able to survey the battle that he's in, and begins to be able to look and see, okay, is there a unity, right, behind this? Is there something is there a body out of which all of these many heads spring? Because it looks just like a nest of serpents, and sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where you're like with the plumbing, right? It says nest of copper pipes. It's this nest of serpents. It's all of these things. What you have to do is trace it back. You have to look back and see, okay, is there actually a source? Right? Because it's the body of the beast. It's the monster itself that's the adversary. It's not all the many heads, right? To fight out all of those kinds of things is just to get more and more and more ensnared and enmeshed in the trap. But we have to instead look, okay, where is this actually coming from? Is there actually some kind of unity at the bottom? And I think that that's something that we need to do in the world today, is to be able to take a step back, not fight every single battle, but to look and try to see, like, are there commonalities with some of these issues? And a lot of these issues, they don't seem to have obvious relation to one another, but I think that there actually is. I think that there is a unity. We'll talk about it later in the episode and in subsequent episodes, but I think there is kind of a unity at the bottom. There is something that we can kind of unify against as a common adversary, but we have to be able to look past the snakes. We have to be able to look past all of the various multiplicity of issues and try to go back to the source. Let me go back to my plumbing story. Okay, so here I am, rending my garments, and eventually I was, able to pull myself back together enough to, take a little bit of get a bit of a clearer, broader view of what was going on with the plumbing. And what I started to realize is I started to notice some similarities between different things that I had noticed, various plumbing issues around the house, not just in that one particular bathroom, but in a bunch of other places as well. And I started to notice certain things, which was that I noticed that there were certain metal fixtures that were getting corroded. And so I took a closer look at the toilet, the one that I had moved in and the one that we had removed, and I could see that the reason why that they were leaking was for the same reason, which is that there were these little metal bolts that secure the kind of top part of it to the bottom part. I'm sure this is not exactly proper plumbing terminology. As I said, I am not a plumber, but nonetheless, some other plumber can set me straight on this. But the top and the bottom part of the toilet, they're secured together by these bolts. And what had happened was they had rusted and corroded away to the point where it was leaking. The water was leaking out. And I said, that's very curious that this has happened in both of these appliances in exactly the same way. And I started to think, oh, you know what? I've noticed certain things like this happening around the house. We'd had some problems with valves that were getting stuck, and we had problems with piping under one of the sinks that had just kind of like corroded and fallen apart. And so I started to realize is, oh, maybe what the problem that I have here is not a problem with this pipe or a problem with this appliance or a problem with this issue over here. What I have is a water problem, right? There's something going on with the water. And so I was able to get somebody in who was able to test the water and take a look at it. And he says, sure enough, you've got all kinds of minerals and iron and different things in your water that are causing this to happen. And so we ended up getting, writing a very large check to put in a fancy water treatment system, which, that it hurts, but you got to do it, right? So we put in this water treatment system and boom, the problems are gone, right? Like that was it. All of these multiplicity of problems, all of these snakes that were, just coming up all of these different places, it all came back to this one source, and being able to address that and deal with that issue, that was the answer. Otherwise, it would just be constantly replace this, replace that. And so having to do that, to go to the source of it. And I think it's a similar situation for us here today. It's a similar situation in the story of Hercules. Hercules, what he begins to do is he actually takes, in some versions of the story, he takes a torch and he begins to cauterize the different heads so that they stop multiplying. He says, okay, I'm not going to fight all of these battles. I'm going to seal these things off so that they don't multiply. And then he attacks the heart of the beast. He attacks the monster. And so we need to think a little bit about, okay, is there some kind of unity? Is there some source that is at the bottom of this? But the first thing that we have to do is be able to take a step back and just survey the situation, survey the landscape. What are some of this multiplicity of issues that we are seeing today? And can we see, is there any kind of connection? Is there any kind of connectivity between these? And so what I want to do here today for the remainder of our time is just do that. We're going to just look at some of the various societal sort of ills, you could say, that we've seen arisen over the past, maybe few decades here and even more recently in the world today. And we want to just kind of think, okay, is there anything that's maybe common to this? Is there some way that we can address this here together? And so we want to ask is, what are these issues that we're seeing in the world today? And I think one of the things that is the most apparent is we're seeing a communication breakdown, right? A lot of the reason why it seems like we're having so much difficulty being able to trust one another and relate to one another and have meaningful conversations is there's this kind of communication breakdown that we see happening. It almost feels like words themselves are are sort of failing us, that we've kind of lost the ability to be able to understand one another. And I think that part of the reason why that is the case is because there seems to be this we seem to be in this state of flux where meanings are constantly morphing. Meanings are constantly changing. Language is the sort of thing that's always in flux. It's always evolving. It's always changing. As we communicate with one another, language changes. That's just the way that the world works. But it takes time, right? And generally it takes a long time. And so meanings, words that had one meaning, slowly morph, and they slowly change, and they slowly start to take on other meanings as well and other nuances. And so things that, we think, maybe hundreds of years ago meant one thing, they don't necessarily mean the same thing today. But generally speaking, these things happen very slowly. And so there's time for us as a culture to be able to reacquaint ourselves with the meanings and to adjust the way that we act and the way that we speak so that we understand one another. But now, with the advent of the internet and with the advent of the information age, there's so much communication happening all the time that it just feels like words are just constantly changing. And it's almost gotten to a place now where we almost feels like we see words differently, where historically we had always seen words and meanings being closely locked together, that the word and the meaning of the word, that these things were very tightly meshed together. But now it almost feels like there's this sense of language being constantly pliable, constantly flexible, that it can change, and what meant one thing one year can mean something else the next year, and that even there's even a sense maybe as well where words can kind of be changed and twisted to maybe fit certain agendas. And so we're seeing all kinds of words kind of change their meaning, even just in terms of like words that are very meaningful, words that are very important. I think about things like, we just think about some of the deep words, some of the powerful, meaningful words like love, and words like religion, or words like justice, or God, or equality, or gender, or belief, or belonging. Like, all of these are very important, meaningful words, but it depends, and they mean something to all of us. But I think that what they might mean specifically to one person might be something that's radically different from someone else. And so I think we have a lot of times we have a hard time communicating because of the constant changing of words and the changing of language. And so meaning and words don't seem to be as closely connected with one another anymore. And this seems to play out itself as well in another way, and we could see this as well happening in the world around us, which is the way in which we actually see facts, right? Where we see, it used to be that we kind of thought of the world as being essentially made up of more or less immutable facts, like that the world is the way that it is, and we seem to be able to. There used to be historically a very strong sense, I think, of trust in the way that these facts are being reported and being conveyed to us, whether those are in books or through the media or through the press or these kinds of things. But that has been called more and more into question, I would say, within the last decade or so, again, with the advent of the internet and social media and all of these other kinds of channels of receiving information, that we start to see kind of phrases like the phrase fake news, right? Like, that was never a thing. Like, what is fake news? It just almost feels like it's an oxymoron, right? It's just this kind of thing of like, sometimes phrases get thrown around, fake news, alternative facts, so that there's multiple ways of seeing every situation, and you look something up online or you go to fact check it, and it's really hard because it's like there's 5 different sources that all have a different hot take on this same sort of issue. And the way that the internet and the kind of attention getting sort of paradigm of the internet seems to be working or failing to work is that the hottest take is the one that gets championed the most loudly. And so there's this question of like, well, can I even trust what I read? Can I even trust what I see? Like, what about the world in terms of current events or even historical events? Another thing that we've seen arise over the past bit of time here is we've seen a different kind of a changing view of the way that we even look at history, right? So there's a certain sense in which historically we would say that the events of the past were generally trusted to be the way that we understood them to be, the way that we were taught about in school, or that were passed down to us, or that we read about as we were growing up, and we say, okay, yeah, that's more or less the way that it is. But now there seems to be some pushback against that, and with the rise of things like, for example, what's referred to as critical theory, the idea that that essentially that the world can be understood in the sense of power dynamics, and everything can be subdivided into categories of oppressed and oppressor, right? And that it is typically the oppressor, it is the ones in power that are the ones that write the history books. And so why is it that we should believe that those narratives are actually trustworthy? And so there's this whole kind of sort of subversion of that, this kind of calling into question of, like, you know, ancient monuments or ancient stories or things that were kind of passed down for generations. We begin to say, well, actually, was that even actually true, or was that just sort of the propaganda of the time that's been passed down to us? And so there's questions about that as well, and it becomes this almost sort of Orwellian or Huxleyan sort of kind of vision of the world, where it's like the world controllers, to use Huxley's language here, the world controllers, they're the ones that control the narrative, and they're the ones that determine what's true and what's put down the memory hole, right? What gets forgotten and taken away. And I just want to read to you this quote from Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And in this passage, the world controller, Mustafa Mond, is speaking, and he's speaking to the protagonist, and he's describing the power of these controllers to just make history whatever they want it to be. And so he sort of just waves his hand, and it says, "Whisk, where was Odysseus, and where was Job, and where were Jupiter and Gautama and Jesus? Whisk, and those specks of antique dirt called Athens and Rome, Jerusalem, and the Middle Kingdom, all were gone. Whisk, the place where Italy had been was empty. Whisk, the cathedrals. Whisk, whisk, King Lear and the thoughts of Pascal. Whisk, passion. Whisk, requiem. Whisk, symphony. Whisk." And so it's this kind of idea with a wave of his hand, with a whisk of his hand, that we can just dismiss all of these things that were thought to be solid, that were thought to be passed down to us instead. And so, and we've kind of changed the way that we look at the world. We've kind of changed the way that we look at history. There's this sort of sense of what Orwell calls double think, this idea that something can be both true and false at the same time, that it can be both real and unreal at the same time as well. And we see this, I would say, evolving when it comes to our interactions in the digital age, that so much of our time and so much of our lives are spent online, and as we do that, there's sort of a kind of weird changeability that we begin to see the world through. It's this sort of lens that, like, things can constantly be in a state of changing. We think about phrases like virtual reality, right, or artificial intelligence, and these kinds of expressions. They seem to be oxymorons, right? Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, unreal reality, something that is and is not at the same time. It's this like paradoxical thing, but we just sort of accept it. It's kind of like that Orwellian double think, that something can be both artificial and also real at the same time. But this is more and more the space that we inhabit, and I think it changes the way that we think. It changes the way that we view the world. And it becomes this kind of virtual landscape. And we think about the way that even digital media, things, used to be books, right? It used to be physical media. It used to be physical things that if you wanted to redact a newspaper, you would have to do that. You would have to pull it back and reprint it. And there would be apology and embarrassment and all those kinds of things. If you wanted to get rid of the works of Shakespeare and Gautama and Jesus, you would have to literally burn books, right? Like, this is what they did in Nazi Germany. They would literally burn books. And what Ray Bradbury writes about in Fahrenheit 451, the burning of books. But we've gotten to a place now in history where books don't even need to be burned anymore, that things are virtual, and that media is digital. Everything is experienced online. And so things can be just deleted, right? Like, they can just disappear, and there's not even a puff of smoke, and they're just gone, like they didn't even exist at all. And so there's, so if there's problematic things that we see online, or quotes, posts can be deleted, facts can be redacted, even profiles and people and all these kinds of things can just sort of be erased and taken out of the limelight. This is the idea of cancel culture. We've seen that over the past few decades as well. And so it's this idea, this kind of alarming idea that things are not solid, that things are constantly in flux, they're constantly changing, they're constantly getting buried, and the narrative is constantly changing as well. And we see this, I think, even most recently with the rise of AI, right? So with the rise of AI, it's very alarming because it gets to the point where you can't be sure of what you're seeing. Like, is it actually real? So when you look online, if you're scrolling along and you say, okay, I see, the face of a person, or I see a quote that is attributed to a person. It's like, if you're not going to run down that quote or that soundbite or whatever it is, and fact check that a lot of times we can just be taking in misinformation all the time. It could be just something that was just artificially generated. It's even getting to the point now where, as an artist, this is something that's very concerning for me, because art was always the hallmark of humanity, right? You look back at cave paintings, you look back at, the countless millennia where you go back and you can see kind of the rise of humanity, and we can see, oh yeah, these are signs of humanity. And what is it that we see? It's art, right? It's art on cave walls, and it's art, and it's pigments and those kinds of things. Art was always an expression that was a distinguishing feature of humanity, that this was something that would distinguish human beings from every other form of life, every other form of existence in the world, at least as far as we knew, was that intelligence, that humanity was characterized by our ability to create. Well, now we've created this sort of thing that can replicate or imitate art. And so now when you look and you see a piece of art, you have to look and see, it's like, is that actually human created? I don't know. If you hear a piece of music, is that created by a human being, or is that created by a machine? Like, we don't know. And it starts to call into question, like, what does it mean to be a human being, right? Like, what does it even mean to be a creator? What does it mean to even be alive? Like, these are deep, deep questions. What does it mean to be conscious? And this is, of course, given rise to some of the really hot button issues of today, and we've seen a lot of societal uproar about AI. We've also seen a lot of uproar and a lot of controversy around questions of things like transgenderism and transhumanism, these kinds of questions, right? That historically there had been kind of a commonly accepted there had been sort of a common acceptance that there were certain limitations that were just even physiological limitations on what it is to be human and what it is to operate in the world and operate in society and in culture as a human being, whether male or female, etc. And those kinds of things. And now there's sort of these questions that are being raised as to, well, maybe that's actually not the case. Like, maybe there's ways of transcending that. Maybe there's ways of transcending some of these limitations. And here, of course, there's the temptation, even as I'm saying this, I can almost sense the temptation to get like into the weeds on the debate, right? Like, oh, like which side of the transgenderism debate do we find ourselves on, or the transhumanist debate, or the AI debate, or any of these issues? We can start feeling ourselves want to get pulled into the weeds, but that's the trap, right? Like, that's the hydra, to get pulled into the controversy, to get pulled into every single argument. And I'm not saying we can't have intelligent conversations about these issues, but listen, friends, like, there's a whole lot of that. Like, you go online, you talk to anybody, like anybody will give you their hot take on AI or any of these kinds of things. And so what I would say is, I don't think we need a lot more of that. I think what we need is more ability to take a step back from all of these hot issues, not get pulled in so much by them, and be able to actually consider and look and say, okay, are there similarities? Is there a common source? Is there something out of which all of these kinds of things are springing? Because they don't seem to be obviously related, right? Like critical theory, and political divisions and stuff like that doesn't seem to have a lot to do with AI. And AI doesn't seem to have a lot, to do with questions about history, or questions about, what it is to be any of these kinds of questions, right? You can take any of them, and they don't seem to necessarily be obviously related to one another, but I think that they are. And perhaps as I've been just kind of talking through this, and we've been talking about this together here, maybe you've sensed a little bit of a common thread through this. And I think that what that common thread is, what it kind of goes back to, is this sense of questioning about the reality of the world, right? Like, there's all of these issues are calling into question, whether it is fake news or whether it is, our views on virtual reality, or all of these kinds of things. They're questions about the nature of reality. Is reality something solid, or is it something that is constantly in flux? And I think that what has given rise to this sort of question, this larger question that manifests itself out in lots and lots of different ways, is the philosophy that has become generally referred to as postmodernism. And postmodernism is a philosophy that's been around for a while, so that this is not something that's radically new. But I think that we are experiencing now the sort of the final products of this philosophy that's been around for a while. And again, this philosophy, if you're less familiar, is basically the philosophy that places an emphasis on subjective experience of the world over the idea of an objective kind of solidity and reality to the world. And so postmodernism would want to ask those kinds of questions of what is my own experience been? What is my own subjective experience? What is my view? Maybe there's different points of view on this. And so there's maybe not one way of seeing this, but multiple ways of seeing it, multiple narratives, multiple stories. And listen, I think that is actually a really powerful tool. I think that the idea of being able to place yourself in others' shoes and be able to see the world in different ways is really powerful. And it's actually been really, really helpful for us. And particularly, I think even as we're seeing this sort of renaissance of a return to stories in our culture today, that a lot of that is actually owed to postmodernism, the idea that we need to see the world not just as facts, but as a story and a world full of stories. And we need to be able to explore those different ways of seeing the world. But I think that there is also another side to it, which is the side that is essentially that has led to the breakdown of any kind of solidity at the bottom. That postmodernism has slowly kind of pulled the thread of what holds us together and what holds us together as a culture, what holds us together as people, and it has essentially led to, I think, what we're experiencing today, which is the unraveling of reality. We are getting to the point now where it is very deeply a question in the background of all of our minds as to what is real in the world today. And I think there's this hunger and this longing and almost this desperation for we need something real. We need something to be certain. We need something to be at the bottom of all this. And so, but this is the world in which we live. And so I think if we can step back from all of these various kinds of issues, we can see this sort of commonality, this kind of common thread kind of going back. And there are kind of two questions that this raises, which is, how did this come about? How is it that this sort of, this kind of postmodernist hydra, you might say, has come to exist in our society, in our world today? It's where did this thing come from? And I think in order to answer that question, we have to look back at history. We have to look back at where sort of the rise of this philosophy actually springs from, which we will do in subsequent episodes, not here today, but down the line we'll talk about that. And then the other question that's related is there anything that we can do about it? Is there some sort of cure, right? That these kind of serpents, right? These biting heads are venomous, right? And so there's this venom, there's this poison, which is this kind of poisonous idea that, we even see sort of expressed in various movies and various stories here today, tellingly enough, which is this sort of question of maybe nothing is real, right? Maybe it's all just illusory. Maybe there's nothing that you can stand on. And that, I think, is at the bottom of a lot of the mental health crises that we've seen in the world today. And so is there an antidote? Is there a cure? Is there something that we can do about it? And we'll talk more about that a little bit further down the line. But what I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about, and feel free if you'd like to join in the comments and discuss this as well, which is where do we see this expressed? When you take a step back from the many sorts of the manifold issues in the world today, if we can take a step back and resist the temptation to get pulled into these kinds of squabbles on these issues, where are some of the similarities? What are some of the similarities that we see in between these? What are some expressions of this kind of radical skepticism? I would say that we've kind of come to a place of radical skepticism about the world. What are some ways and what are some manifestations in which we see some of these, maybe in our own lives or in the culture kind of more generally? And, we can throw around some thoughts and think about like maybe, what are some things that have given rise to that? And are there some ways that we can push back against that? Or are there some ways that we can try to ground ourselves in something solid, in something that isn't constantly in flux? And what might that look like in our lives personally? What it might look like in more culturally, or even as we're looking at things like, AI created content and that kind of stuff. Is like, are there things that we can do to sort of push back against that without getting pulled into the embroilment of every single biting head that wants to kind of pull us down in that way? And so why don't we continue the conversation by talking about that? So I want to invite you to share some of those thoughts with us. And also, have you ever had a plumbing situation like the one that I've described? And was there a solution that manifested itself as you were able to kind of follow those things back to the source? And so I invite you to join us in the conversation. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to speaking with you again in the next episode.